Hello, good morning, and welcome to another installment of Profiles in Tacticalness. Today, per request, we will be talking about something that everyone's used, the good old Archer. Now, funnily enough, this is one of the units that has seen some of the most extreme high and lows in the series, essentially going from its extremely high point in both versions of Let Us Cling Together, as well as its kind of dull, thrown in the dumpster point of Night and of Lotus. So, alright, let's go ahead and start with Ogre Battle 64. This is when the class first appeared. I may be wondering, hey, what about March of the Black Queen? That had a whole bunch of units in it. Very true. However, at that point, your base starter unit for all your female characters was just a Amazon, so they just went there and fired arrows and presumably delivered packages. And that was about it. That was their base class. They upgraded into everything else, so there really was no reason for an archer in that one. They finally made them their own dedicated class once they got to OB64. They were a basic upgrade. They weren't anything terribly flashy or special, but they got a bit higher dex, as they should. Once we get into the SNES version of Luck, though, that's when we start getting into the absolutely terrifying archer that we all know and love. So, obviously, balance was a little bit off on that one. They got a whole lot of dex, they had a weapon that scaled very well with dex. On top of that, they had a benefit that not everyone was aware of, but essentially, you could have them run up and shoot somebody point blank in the face and they would never be counterattacked. Obviously, this is because they're technically using a ranged weapon, but it was a little bit of a funny bit of cheese that I'm pretty sure everybody has tried at one point or another. Essentially, this allowed them to get away with a ton of damage with almost absolute impunity. They had unusually high defense for that kind of unit. They had pretty high resistance, and by and large, up until you got into those end game casters, they were probably going to be your strongest unit. Now, moving on, they got a little bit nerfed when we got to Night of Lotus. When I say a little bit nerfed, I mean they are arguably one of the worst classes in the game, if not the worst in the game. The thing is, the stats got changed pretty significantly in that game. There was no dex, there was just strength, agility, and intelligence, which is a nice little simple way to do it. So the archer's main thing was that they had reasonably high agility, pretty low strength, pretty low intelligence. They had very high range, they had pretty good movement range actually, and essentially they would almost never miss their shots. However, essentially they did almost no damage, which honestly is a pretty historically accurate representation of how archers worked. For those unaware of the general context and all of that, obviously there's been a lot of misconceptions as far as archery and all of that goes, but they were, for all intents and purposes, the old-timey equivalent of what would now be a light machine gun, wherein they're supposed to saturate an area with fire. If they hit something, great. Can they go for all kinds of little weaknesses here and there? Sure. But by and large, they're there to essentially serve as a pressure unit wherever they happen to be. Now, moving back to the actual games here. So, the downside in Night of Lotus is that almost everybody made a better archer than the actual archer. You could go get a Hawkman, you could go get a Angel Knight. Both of them, they have their flying advantage. They've got a strength advantage. They're going to be better. If you want a infantry guy, you got your sword masters. They're going to do way better at being an actual archer. So, a little bit of a bummer, but hey, they're nice. They're pretty friggin' stylish. So if you want them, you got them. Now we move on to the PSP remake, and this is once again where things get a little bit dicey. See, they tried to go and nerf it. They tried to find a little middle ground between the last two versions that they put out there. Unfortunately, they kinda missed the mark because presumably they misunderstood their own system a little bit. See, early on, you may have noticed that the early archers do that exact role. They still have decent damage, but they serve as mostly a harassment unit. Their accuracy isn't perfect, but once they get tremendous shot, they're able to take a perfectly aimed shot every now and then. So they're a good backliner. They harass, they pick off squishies. It's nice. However, there were a lot of hidden bonuses they put in there, specifically towards most weapons that use dex as a skill, so like daggers, katanas, bows, all that kind of thing. So they got a hidden bonus when it came to the actual background stuff. They had an extra bonus when it came to the bow's damage itself. Specifically, great bows are the ones that I'm talking about, since their damage got way higher than it needed to be. And yeah, on top of that, they had a whole bunch of kill moves that scaled with TP. So essentially, they scaled damage. They also had multiple moves like Tremendous Shot and Double Shot that allowed them to get disgusting amounts of damage out of their shots. So it was functionally like they went and replaced their bows with an anti-tank rifle. They could go and usually insta-kill almost anything if you trained them right. And yeah, it was a little bit of a downer. A little bit of a downer. Again, another little historical note here. As far as arrows, disabling units, and stuff like that, in many cases, people are essentially being mentioned as retreating or disabled or something else. Arrows, in many cases, when, like, for example, say somebody got hit in the foot, they're not going to continue fighting, so it's not like the person got one-shotted, they just got taken out of the fight. So that's one of those things that gets a little bit misunderstood, because it's still, a stick. It is essentially a stick puncturing someone. There's not a lot of mass. Most armors are able to glance off arrows without much issue. Actually, by around the 15th, 16th century, all that, armors became, well, better armors became almost entirely arrow-proof, even at close range. So, either way, that's just a random little caveat here for you. So now, after all this other stuff, you might be wondering, what did One Vision do? Why do you keep saying that they're so much better? Well, they probably got one of the sharpest nerfs in the entire game. Now, you might be saying, hey, wait a minute, how is that a nice thing? Well, here's the thing. They were previously ridiculously overpowered, but don't get me wrong, it's not like they didn't get a whole bunch of good bonuses out of it. So, let's talk their equipment first of all. So they still have their longbows. You actually can go with a short bow and dagger build. Still very viable. You can also go short bows and bow guns and shields. Very viable. Essentially, that's if you want to have them in your front line. Interestingly enough, this was actually a historical strategy. If you've heard of the Pavis, probably one of the more famous strategies, or one of the more famous examples, were the Genovese crossbows. They essentially like to use shields and crossbows in the front line. Actually, it's one of the fact that the French army prevented them from using their shields is one of the things that got them killed at the Battle of Agincourt. Anyhow, moving on. So as far as their equipment goes, most of the time you will be using these right here. So these are your standard longbows with 3 to 8 range. Essentially, you may notice their recovery time is fairly high as well as their weight. So essentially, if you stood in place and fired, they will have a pretty decent fire rate. But if you're running around trying to reposition them all of the time, then you're going to have a much harder time because, the weight of their bow essentially causes them to be much slower when they're moving. This is more of a balance thing than a realism thing, but they do have one extra movement tile from base game, so the best way to actually utilize them is to essentially just get them into position, keep them well defended, and fire from exactly where they are. So that part would be fairly accurate right there. Now, the second type of bow that you can get is the siege bow here. So right here, actually I forget if you called them siege bows or war bows, but basically same thing. These get 6 to 10 range, so they have some of the longest range in the game. Actually, I believe the second longest range in the game. They take a little bit of an accuracy penalty. However, they do a little bit higher damage. They have far more forgiving vertical scaling, so they can, shoot upwards. They have a bigger dead zone, and they can't fire past their range at all. But these are some of my favorite things in the game because they allow for very, very, very long range harassment. Next up, we have the crossbows, and obviously crossbows are crossbows. You have two different variants of them. One of them is right here. You've got the 2 to 7 on the one-handed variant. You've got the 2 to 9 on the standard variants, and then you've got these sort of railgun type crossbows here that have 14 range on them. This is the highest range in the game, even past guns, but essentially they can only fire in one direction and with very little verticality. So they can potentially snipe very well, but you have to be careful with their positioning. They do a fair bit more damage, but they're very good with that. Now, armor-wise, typically what you'll probably be using is bracers and a vest on them. Vests are more or less the main armor for them. You've got the heavy vests here, like the Crucible armor. You've got the Damask vest here for just your basic evasion. There's obviously side grades on each of these, so you can customize it as you see fit. Personally, I think something like Nomad gloves would probably be ideal. So for those unaware, nomad gloves and are basically their own type of category. Essentially, you have gloves that will give you a luck bonus, and so essentially, if you're getting free crits out of their shots, obviously that's always going to be a very good thing. You can have the heavily armored variants here, which will essentially just give a bonus to Dex and Strength for more consistent damage. You can have a Saleh on them for more accuracy and resistance. And you can, and yeah, just kind of mix and match these as you see fit. So the ones that I was showing off here, we have these guys who are all specialized for just bow skill in general. These guys are showing off a more, I would say, power-based speed build. So the Void Ring is one of the new jewelry pieces. It's actually craftable around Chapter 4 there, and essentially it serves as a weight reducer of 10, so they can fire much faster. You have these guys that are pretty much built around magic resistance, and these guys that are just built around some general tankiness. And alright, so let's see how their abilities have changed. Because looking at all these things, you may notice these numbers are much lower than before. And that's the thing, they can do comparable damage to before. However, due to the way that armor works in One Vision, essentially if there's a heavily armored unit, they will take next to no damage from a bow. But if there's a unit that's, say, just a squishy in the back line, for example, something that would be very easily hit by a siege bow, then essentially you can use archers to repeatedly harass them, cause the healers to back up and have to heal their squishy units, allowing you to break through a front line, for example. Or for, say you want to just have a bunch of them suddenly pile on a healer. Now, in a lot of cases, due to the fact that healers have access to different pieces of medium and heavy armor, they can sometimes be a little bit harder to take out now. So in those cases, you usually want to use something like a crossbow, whose kill move now gives a stun effect instead of an AoE. So looking through these abilities real quick, they've got the same ones as before for the most part. So they've still got Tremendous Shot. That's your guaranteed crit shot. You've got your double shot. Like it says here, you can't use it beyond weapon range. This one is going to be far better on siege bows, if you ask me, siege bows and crossbows. You got Eagle Eye, which has changed, so you get True Flight and Sidestep instead of whatever it used to be before. You get Reflect, you get your TP bonuses, you get a jump bonus if you want it. You get your usual wards. Counter Hit, although it's not really worthwhile for them. Deflect is probably what I would recommend if you really need one of those. You can have an Augment if it fits the particular weapon that you give them, and then they can use daggers, sidearms, bows, and crossbows. Now, if you're wondering, hey, what's a sidearm? This isn't referring to pistols, don't worry. So, thrown weapons and blowguns actually got combined into one category. Since thrown weapons are now just a weapon, you don't have to go and craft 50 of them to be able to even make use of the darn skill. So yeah, they're just a very heavy thrown weapon. So if you want to go, shield and throwing spear on them, works perfectly fine. If you want to go, blowgun and dagger, go for it. There's a way to make that work. So yeah, they basically got access to every ranged weapon except for a gun. Well, I guess technically and a spellbook, but that's its own kettle of fish. So without any further ado, let's probably get this crap going. Take a look at what they can do here. Like I said, their armor choices, they've got enough to cover pretty much any build you want to do with them. They're just never going to be super tanky, but they can be on the heavier side. So, funnily enough, we wound up starting a battle in the rain here. And one thing you'll notice right off the bat, let's see. Yeah, these are in the back row, so these are going to be the ones that are properly doing stuff differently here. Okay, so right there, not enough range. This one, though, or no, wait, I'm sorry. It's actually the other one with the longer range. Yeah, this one probably still wouldn't be able to hit. So if we move over here, you really just want to keep them in the same spot for the most part, but I want her to be able to get this shot. Now you can see, this damage, not terribly impressive. Essentially for the archers, the crossbows are their main method for getting past armor. So this guy, pretty heavily armored, he's got full worm scale and he's got a two-hander. So he's got the pretty standard Dragoon set. Now this one, I believe, is one of the longer ones. Yes. So you can see, we're getting a little bit more damage out of the siege bow, but you can get significantly longer range, can just sit in place, just basically sit and snipe. That's what archers do best. Now, for squishy units, they're going to be fantastic. Like, for example, if you're fighting fairies, if you're fighting other archers, you're fighting rogues like here, those almost become a non-issue in many cases. But as you can see here, their damage is pretty uniform, generally staying a little bit under, I would say a little under 15% for their overall damage. Now, the bow users are going to be firing first, since their weapons are a little bit lighter. The crossbows take longer to reload, but they're going to have a much easier time actually getting past armor. This guy here is just going to hit twice because he has the cursed bow. Which, by the way, cursed weapons. That's another thing that I just wanted an excuse to actually shove into this. Cursed weapons are actually good now. They basically are a sort of double hit that varies depending on the weapon. By the way, right there, one-handed crossbow, almost doing as much damage as a bow. I believe this one should also be a one-hander. Yeah, these are all the frontline guys. So I'm gonna leave him to get... Actually, no, this one should be the heavy crossbow. Okay, so for comparison, a cursed crossbow would be able to do about 140 to him, so comparatively almost double the damage. And standard one here, Astra, no, Astra is the super long one. So as you can see, very, very, very long range. Not always the best accuracy. In this case, they're firing at a fairy head-on, but still, if you get a bunch of these lined up, it can be very devastating. So let's have Colbert here run up and take a little bit of a snipe, because why not? Almost everybody's going to have bad accuracy against a fairy that looks to be using an evasion build in the rain. Yeah, they've got a vest, I believe a light shield. Yeah, they've got a light shield, a light vest, and some leggings. So they're getting avoidance from everything but their dagger. Yeah, I think they're gonna do a pretty okay wow, words are difficult. Job dodging stuff. That's what I was trying to say here. And there we go. Standard crossbow does about 80 to 90 compared to the bow's 60 to 70. So yeah, your standard crossbows, they're going to do about, give or take, 50% to 100% more than the bow, depending on the situation. Now, like I said, against squishies, they're all going to be pretty devastating, especially once they start using their guaranteed moves. So the archers at this point, they're not terribly flashy, but they're good at what they do. They're there for the sake of essentially focus firing on one guy, or for the sake of shutting down certain units wherever you want them to be. Personally, as per usual, I like having a squad of about 2 or 3. In some cases, you can, go about 4 or 5 on them, just have them harassing everywhere. You're basically sacrificing, in many ways, you're sacrificing damage potential from other classes for the sake of having control over how certain units are doing. Alright, so right here, we get some heavily armored guys here. They're going to be taking a little bit different damage here. Like, for example, if we wanted to go for that guy. One thing I would say is they do get access to the bash skill, so if you've got something like a siege bow, you end up going for the bash ability, you'll be able to just go and pretty much keep a bunch of units out in the back, which is what these guys do best, really. So, alright. I would advise keeping Tremendous Shot on everyone. Since this was an AI team and I was trying to show off a few things, I just went ahead and didn't end up doing that. But yeah, something to keep in mind. But I think that about covers what I wanted to cover here. So at any rate, hope this was interesting. Hope it was somewhat informative. And let me know what you want to see next. Have a good day.